So if you're only going to get one saw, the circular saw is the way to go. Very versatile. It can make all the cuts, but it can be difficult to use. And if you don't know what you're doing, very, very dangerous. So I'm going to go over the top 5 beginner mistakes that people make with the circular saw. More importantly, I'm going to teach you how to avoid them, and then stick around to the last mistake. It could literally save one of your fingers in the future. So this one here can really happen to anyone. It happened to me 15 years ago. Now it happens every once in a while. Even pros can do this. And that is starting the cut with the blade in contact with your material. It's really quite easy to do, because to line up a cut and get it tracking nicely, you want to line up the front notch of your saw and the blade with your cut line. That way it's going to be tracking parallel right off the start. In that case here, you get this front part lined up, then you line up your blade, and the mistake is to pull the trigger in contact. What ends up happening is you get a big chip out in your wood. And if you're dealing with some nicer material, say some finished plywood or some expensive plywood, it's a freaking disaster. What you want to do is line up your cut, line up the blade, pull it back about 1/2 inch to 1 inch, get the blade up to full speed, and then go ahead and make your cut. Now this one here, highly recommend if you're just using a circular saw for the first time, or you're not very confident with it. I would avoid using one hand to make cuts. 2 hands is going to be a lot safer. In order to do that, you really need to clamp your material down. For this little setup that I have here, I've attached this 2x4 to the sawhorses with some screws underneath, just so it's nice and solid and it's not going to slip around. Then just take some clamps. You're making a cut here on the end. Clamp your piece down nice and tight. That way you can have 2 hands on the saw, full control. If there's any kickback, this top hand is going to resist it. And if you don't have sawhorses or a nice workbench that you can clamp things to, just do what carpenters do most of the time on the job site, and that is they will cut on a pile of material, throw some 2x4s or whatever you have on the ground, put the piece that you're cutting, put your foot on top of it as your clamp. That way you can have 2 hands on the saw and you can make safe cuts that way. It's a great way to just get a feel for the saw. As you develop some strength, you can definitely go to the one hand cutting where your other hand is clamping and holding the material, and that speeds things up considerably. But to start off with, 2 hands on the saw is the way to go. Setting the proper blade depth is critical. There's really 2 bad things that can happen if you don't get the right depth for your cut. If you leave your blade at full depth and you're cutting some plywood, you're cutting some material on top of some sacrificial material, maybe a workbench, maybe some styrofoam. If you leave the blade at full depth, you're going to destroy this material underneath. Worst case scenario here, you cut right through these in the middle and you get a real binding situation. So you want to be careful of that. You want to set your blade depth about 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch past the material that you're cutting. For this 3/4 inch plywood, we would set it to about 7/8 inch. There's a little gauge on the side of the saw here. Check it out. And then the more important reason here that you want the proper blade depth, especially for plywood, is you're going to get a lot nicer, cleaner cut on the top edge. Let's just demonstrate that quickly. We'll cut into this plywood here, put the glasses back on. Now you can see that cross cut is pretty nice and pretty clean. If you leave your blade at full depth, it's just going to tear the fibers. The reason for that is when the blade is at full depth, the angle and the geometry of the teeth is pretty much coming straight out of the material and cutting the fibers. The shallower you leave it, the more it's going to be coming forward and the cleaner cut that you're going to get. So be mindful of your blade depth for all of your cuts. You're making the cut, there's flex in the material. As you're cutting through, it flexes more and more and it's going to want to bind on the blade. I'll show you what happens. When it comes to not binding your material, there's really just a couple simple principles to follow. Don't make cuts in between two fixed points. If I wanted to cut this 2x4 in half, the way to do that, sacrificial support here, throw it on top. You can do a couple things. You can throw it over here and cut it off that way, or even leave it right on top of the supports. Then you could cut it in the middle because this is supported here with this 2x4. 2x4 is going to be kind of your minimum support because it's going to offer a nice solid base that's not going to flex. So yeah, just be mindful. This comes into play a lot more when you have plywood on your surface. Let's say you have a big plywood sheet and you want to rip it across this middle here. Let's say this was an 8-foot sheet. You can definitely do that with this type of a setup. The only thing you want to be careful of is just move your other support in closer. Then you could go ahead and cut that in the middle and you're not going to get any flex. Just be mindful of where the flex in your material is and avoid it, because like I said before, with the more powerful saws, things can get a little scary. So if you're ever really going to hurt yourself with a circular saw, this is how it is going to happen. By putting your hand, your foot, your knee, any part of your body behind the cut path, directly behind the cut path, it's really a dangerous position to be in, because circular saws, if things are going to go wrong, it's going to kick backwards. And if you're ever going to cut your fingers off, this is pretty much exactly how it will happen. Let's say you're cutting a strip off this piece of plywood, you're cutting through. And at about this point here, you decide you don't want this to fall and hit the ground. So you're going to reach your hand and support the material. As you cut through the end here, the saw becomes a little bit unstable. And if you're not careful, this thing can cut back, skate right over your fingers. If you've set the proper depth, it's going to be ugly. If you've left it full depth, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. Fingers on the ground. What you want to do is if you don't want this piece to fall down, you have to do a little preventative maintenance here. Throw a little side piece in, maybe throw a couple in, get everything nice and level. One's going to be the minimum. As you cut through here, that's going to keep this from wanting to tear out. Whatever you do, keep your body parts away from the back of your circular saw cut path. And hey, if you want to keep developing your circular saw skills, check out this video right over here. That was lame, but I think I'm getting better. Or am I getting worse? We don't know. So this is a thing that's happening. I have to get the hot dog fingers out of the garbage because it didn't turn out the first time. Oh God. This is gross.